Yes.
Oh, and that beat me to it.
Oh,
Or
she's quicker on the button. Good morning. Welcome to our special committee for side yard setbacks meeting. Why don't we go ahead and take roll there, Dustin?
I will do that. It's
Okay,
um
thank you, Annette.
yep, Dan Young,
Here.
Todd Byverther,
Here?
Tom Young,
Here.
Shell Anderson,
I'm here.
and Jay Arnold.
Here.
That's everybody.
All right. And then do we have any members of the public that would like to introduce themselves?
I don't see any public in attendance today.
Oh, okay. Because I see
Patrick just
Patrick
jumped on.
I
Yeah,
see Patrick.
Oh,
just jumped on.
just
okay.
jumped on. So does Patrick want to introduce himself, or he's probably saying we all know him?
Yeah, I think you all know me at this point, but Patrick Hanks with the Building Industry Association of Washington. Thank you.
All right. Welcome, Patrick. All right. So we need to review and approve the agenda that we have up here.
So moved.
Second,
Okay.
Todd.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll go to a vote. All in favor, please say aye.
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 All right. Motion passes. And then if we could then review and approve the minutes, if we could get those up there, Dustin.
Okay, Todd, I move to approve.
Second, Jay.
All right. We have a motion and second. Any discussion? All right. Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. So we could get on to the next section, which is the discussion. I know part of it was we were going to review other jurisdictions. I did not get a chance to get a hold of Vancouver, but I did get information from Marysville that they adopted in September 5-foot paved pathway for theirs. The difference I think with Marysville is they had a 44-inch paved pathway, and theirs says 5-foot paved pathway that is free of obstructions were determined by necessary by the fire district to ensure adequate access for emergency services to the rear of the building. So a little bit different, but they already had a 44-inch. Dustin.
I was just curious, is that their standard setbacks ordinance, or is that something special that they have on file?
That is, hang on a second, I gotta scroll up. It was a change to their setback ordinance.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I did post on here the setback section for the Seattle code in there. And as I was trying to read through it and say this is for sure what we would be pointing to if we were trying to compare apples and oranges on this, it seems like generally they have a 5-foot side yard setback, but I didn't have a chance to fully review and get in there and outline exactly what we'd be looking for.
Okay. Tom.
Okay. Hey, so it's probably would be probably a bit better if the legislative committee meeting was ahead of this meeting because some things I would say in the legislative committee meeting would kind of affect what we're trying to do here. And so the legislative committee is kind of intended to be aware of legislative matters, not just pertaining to the State Building Code Council matters, but just other legislative matters that might, be useful or important for us when we're making certain kind of decisions. And so the legislature very recently passed a lot of laws and imposed a lot of laws to get more housing built, because the cost of housing is just too high. So, in being able to achieve that, certain maybe like more cost-effective construction methods, but also allowing more types of housing and eliminating like single-family zoning, allowing up to six units per lot for middle housing, parking reduction, lot splitting without going through some public, process, and it can be done administrative. So this is very high, getting more housing and getting housing more affordable, getting greater use of the land is a very, very high priority. So whatever we do, we should also consider that, these are their priorities and these are their recent priorities. And so, so a lot of these laws really affect their zoning codes directly. And then it's also affecting some of the building codes indirectly. And kind of this example where all of a sudden you're allowed to put 6 units on a lot before you could only put, one structure. And then the side yard setbacks indeed are the setbacks on the side yard to the property line. But now you have 6 units, and really there's only like 2 side yard setbacks and 1 rear yard setback for the property. And so, this kind of gap and pathway, in between these additional structures are not anticipated or not addressed in the really current zoning code, let's say even. And so this has kind of came up, I guess, through the firefighters and being concerned about being able to, get people out on a gurney. And so, so I think in this case, this what we're trying to do here is it's not for like firefighting that we're kind of addressing, is for, first response being to get the gurney out in the pathway. And so, but also understanding the legislature's desire to maximize the use of the available land that we have. And so, we kind of say, hey, what do we need to do and keep that at a minimum? If we need a 5-foot radius at the entrance to the structure, and if a 3 or 4 foot pathways, necessary to, wheel it, to the street or something, that's kind of what we should try to target to. And that way we're following what the legislature wants to do, is maximize the use of land, get the most number of units in the remaining available land here.
All right, thanks. Angela, you were next.
Yeah. I mean, currently we have required fire separation distances, which usually amount for non-sprinkler to a 5-foot, or I mean to 10 feet between structures, or 6 feet if they're sprinklered. So at this point, I mean, are we kind of trying to implement something that says that in those areas that are going to usually be there anyway, that we just want paved surface, or more of a distinct, so they aren't planting or blocking? Is that kind of the end game here?
Yeah, I think so. Like the Marysville one, I think the way they did it is to ensure adequate access for emergency services to the rear of the building. And, with what Tom also said, they want more density, I think is the right way to say it. But, we have to make sure that when we are going more dense, that we are providing access for people in an emergency. And it's not just the gurney. In some cases, it's just, can a firefighter get back there? I
Right.
think,
And
yeah,
yeah, the Marysville one, is that a zoning code or a building code
that's a
for
zoning,
fire?
I think.
Yeah, zoning. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, and when I talked to Tom, he's actually the president of the State Fire Marshals Association too. They sent out a thing before to the builders, and I think probably because they already had 44 inches, going to 5 feet wasn't a big deal to them. They had no opposition to it because they already had the 44. So, I mean, when you're going to compare these things, you have to look at everything. And, already having the 44 and adding 6 inches wasn't a big deal. So, but when you're looking at somebody that doesn't have anything doing it, it's going to be more of a lift. So, Todd, you had your hand up.
Sure. Yeah, I think, this space where we're in right now, we're talking in the special committee. I had advocated for it because I think we needed a place to understand this problem better because to Tom, I was concerned that we come in and preempt with rulemaking authority at the state level, something that, could or should be dealt with local control. And so I really wanted to help unpack that a little bit for all the decision makers, whether it's local or in rulemaking at the state level that we're doing, or it's for the legislature with actual policy. And I think I'm getting closer to understanding the concerns. When it was presented at first, I couldn't tell if it was at the local level concern between, you know, what the fire official has authority over versus the building official, if there's some sort of hierarchy that we have in our state law, obviously the building code over the other codes, if that was the issue. And then as we get more and more into it, and obviously then harmonization with development codes at the local levels is really critical because a lot of these things like Marysville, the city can just do that. They have the ability to have their setbacks, but you take a city like Spokane that has gone through some sort of zoning reform, and I'll use that word, they've already established a 3-foot setback. So this started to come up in Spokane because now by the development code, we have the ability to go to 3 foot. Where is that in conflict with life safety and so forth? And I think we're getting closer. I think Ken brought up an interesting point that I hadn't heard last time that it's not necessarily the straightaway shot to get through whether that's 3 feet or 44 inches. It was that ability to pivot or have an entry that we could get out of and be able to get in line with that. So I think those kind of conversations are valuable when we determine if something needs to go into a building code. So, okay, that's where I think I am. I'm curious what other people think.
Jill.
Yeah, I was trying to diagnose the problem as others have talked about. It sounds like it's every time you turn on a gurney on the way to the entrance, you need the space to turn. 3 feet might be adequate for a straightaway, but for every turn, you might need a 5-foot radius. And that seemed like that would be the cleanest statement of the problem. So that also would then suggest to me that that would be the cleanest thing to put in the code. So and then I guess, with the clear width thing, I think, 3 feet. And so, Todd, to what you were saying, right now, the proposed language says for jurisdictions that do not specify a minimum width of 5 feet is required. So that suggests to me, it's unclear, but it generally suggests to me that jurisdictions could adopt a smaller number if they wanted to, although that might then be less restrictive than the building code, which might not be adequate. I don't know. It's unclear from the language that's proposed whether jurisdictions could then say 4 feet instead of 5 feet. But to me, it says for every 3 foot fine and for straightaways, 5-foot radius at turns would seem to solve the problem as I've heard it. But I also had a question: where does the 44 inches come from? And that's to anybody.
Well, the one, like Marysville had 44 inches, and that may be, and Angela could correct me if I'm wrong. She knows more about the codes on that, but I think, isn't that like in certain areas, like stairways, the minimum is 44 inches and that kind of stuff? That would be my guess.
You're getting into accessibility code is basically you're getting out of IRC is what we want to be aware of is that 36 inches is basically the dimension everywhere for the IRC for doors, stairs, everything. When you start getting bigger than that, you're talking about accessibility requirements or IBC requirements. So again, you might, I mean, I know why we want it and what we want. We're going to have to be able to justify why we're putting these higher requirements on a single family than normal. And so yeah, you're going to want to put a lot of thought into what your actual width is and then have your justification behind it, not just kind of picking numbers out of the air as we sometimes do in the code.
Right, thank you. Tom, I think you were next.
So I think one of the things that you could ask the applicant to do is kind of like do a little like diagram to kind of show you got the turning radius, when you have to maneuver the gurney, and then those areas may be required to be like 5 feet, and then on straightaway path, then that can be narrowed down to a minimum of 3 feet. But let me also kind of add, and in a way to kind of redeem something I said in the last meeting to Jay, that none of the cities took some proactive actions to kind of accommodate the middle housing and increased density. It's not no one, but very, very few. And I can probably count on one hand the number of cities that were proactive, and it's kind of long story, but kind of bear with me a little bit. So, my company was formed, just over 10 years ago. I've been in land development for 25 years. And so I thought I was so clever, I knew that the cities just, adopted their revised comp plan 10 years ago. I hired an intern to say, hey, I know the cities are supposed to take on these additional growth that's been allocated to them, through the state, through the county. And so the easiest way for them to accommodate more growth is to upzone. So essentially, so I had my intern go through and compare the two comp plans to find all the places that they upzone, and I gave her like 6 or 7 cities to look into. Not a single one of those cities upzoned 10 years ago. Not a single one. And so I think that's why this time the state is saying, we gave you guys the opportunity 10 years ago and we saw you guys did nothing. So here you go, all these new regulations. And so, if they just kind of upzone, they really didn't have to write new codes. But now with all this new state legislation, they have all these codes that they have to write. And you know how difficult it is for us to write some of these codes. And even when we put a lot of thought into it, the state said, look, you guys didn't do anything 10 years ago, here you go. 6 lots, per unit, lot splitting, parking reduction, commercial conversion to affordable housing tax incentive, middle housing, do it. Okay, so now the cities are scrambling to write their codes, and those who have not started, I mean, they are in bad shape. And we actually have a project in Kirtland, and they're far ahead of most every other city, but there's still matters that they're still trying to work out. So for those cities that don't have these codes, it's kind of, well, most of them don't have these codes, So I guess the building official is going to try to kind of piecemeal together what kind of existing codes and try to figure this out. So, I think, we may, set the minimum standards to say, okay, show us a path, you can maneuver the gurney straight away, minimum 3 feet, that's the minimum, but, cities could say they want more.
Hey, Todd.
Okay. No, thanks, Tom. And I'll just come back to what I know. I mean, I think some cities are, but Spokane did, and we're trying to right-size things. We figure out where we overcorrected or undercorrected on certain reform. But I'll just maybe ask the question, where does it break down? That was really what I was trying to get to, is if we have a 3-foot setback from the property line to, let's go exterior foundation, or correct me if that's not how it's interpreted. Where would it break down that in a pre-development meeting, when I sit down and present a plan to the city, that someone's not catching that, okay, you got a 3 foot setback to your foundation, but this new state law allows you to do exterior insulation, so that encroaches, 6 inches into that 3 feet. Oh, you have a fence permit and that it's on your side of the property line, so that encroaches another 6 inches. So effectively, you only have two. Like, where would the process not catch that the city would allow that, or have to allow that, where obviously it's not enough space? Does anyone want to talk about that?
I mean, I guess I'm hearing it from the perspective of right now the code requires 3 feet width to get out of a window to a public way. But it doesn't require that to a building entrance, which is, a bit odd. So I guess that's where I see it, Todd.
But I guess if I may, where in that process, as we go around the table in the pre-development meeting, would someone not catch that or have the authority to catch that? I'll stop there. Thanks.
Jay, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just to Todd's point, I think when you're getting into the overlap things, those are the issues that you try to catch in a pre-development meeting, but at least as a city council member, those are the ones we get complaints that somebody comes in and says, wow, we didn't discover the showstopper until late in the process. And it's probably those things that say, oh no, okay, what about the insulation encroachment or a heat pump encroachment or other things that are also in that reduced setback? So, different cities try different things. Pre-development's the best, where you've got planning and fire and public works and everybody around the table to look at things. But it's one of those things that maybe later in the process we're actually looking for sign-offs from each department.
Yeah, and I'll jump in real quick. On that note, like a lot of times when you're, especially at the lot development stage, all they say is we're going to put buildings in. We don't have where the buildings are, So usually that comes in during the building process. So to your point, Todd, I think there's always opportunity to find this, but there's always opportunity to miss it too, depending on what part of the stage you're in. So when you're at the development stage, I sit in there on the fire side, and a lot of times it's just lots. It's when they start putting the lots in, and then the builder decides that I have 30 feet of frontage, right? And so they put in a 24-foot building, right? That's where it I think is where it needs to be caught. So I think there's just a lot of opportunities to catch it, but there's also a lot of opportunities to miss it. And I don't think there's a perfect solution to that. But Joe, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, thanks. And I agree with that. So the development stage starts with there's a piece of property and a developer is looking at it and they're trying to figure out what the rules are around that piece of property. And if the rules are clear, then they can they can do a design on there to decide if they want to buy the piece of property and develop it. If the more unknowns there are, the more dollars the developer feels like they have to make in profit before they're willing to buy the property. So that can also retard development. I was just in a meeting with Seattle City Light earlier this week trying to figure out all the knowns about electrical service to two parcels in this newly upzoned world that we live in. And, in talking with a bunch of developers, their biggest problem is the unknowns when they're developing a piece of property about, electrical service and do I need an underground? Do I need a transformer on a pad underground and all that? And if they can't tell that, they're unlikely to buy a piece of property and develop it, which means that property will not get 4 or 6 or 8 units on it. It'll instead sit, with a single home on it. So the more we can get knowns into the code so the developer can do the pricing on it, do the design on it, and have more certainty as to what the code officials are going to look at, the more likely they are to develop that piece of property. And the more likely we're actually going to get the density that we that the legislature is hoping we do. I don't know if that helps. But it's a different way of looking at it where they want the certainty so they can do the development.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I agree with that. That is a huge thing in this. So anyway, Angela, you're next.
So I guess I I didn't think we were talking about when builders violate the code. Um, I mean, basically, they're supposed to have the setbacks. I mean, I reviewed plans for over 20 years, and basically, at the pre-development, like somebody said, they're not giving us any building details. Pre-development is all about zoning for the most part. I mean, they give us an outline of a structure and say this is roughly where we're going to put it. Is that okay? But it's the it's the building permit portion where we catch that if the designers give us the details that are actually going to be used in the field. I mean, the designers are giving us what they want, and then the contractors are building what they want. And so usually with the encroachments that you're talking about, those those are done because they've deviated from the plans or they didn't, you know, put the building where it was supposed to be or something. But I think for what we're talking about here, for wanting the side yards and stuff, you have to assume that they're following the code, that we're not allowing violations of this stuff because what you're talking about where they're encroaching, 6 inches or a foot is something that shouldn't be being allowed. Um, but I mean, so I'm still, thinking, I mean, you've got usually a minimum between the buildings, so we're still talking about, okay, how much of that do we think need to be actually, paved? Or delineated so that it's not later obstructed so that you can't get there. Does that make sense?
It does to me. You know, it's just one of those things. You can, as being in the enforcement side after the building, in it's commercial and residential. You can put in the best things you want, like having a 5 foot setback, but somebody puts in, they decide to store their lawnmower there or whatever. That's a detriment that we can't control. But I think looking at putting a heat pump in that 3 foot, that's something we can control. So
Right. And I
yeah,
think another thing we need to consider is if this is like a development and they're sprinklering everything and they're allowed to have a 3 foot setback, which means they're 6 feet behind them. Is it going to be acceptable for us to require 5 feet of that to be paved? And also, when you start requiring pavement, you're also affecting the zoning code where they have a maximum impervious area allowance on lots. That also has to do with public works and how much of the lot is covered by impervious area to determine whether they have to do a whole bunch of other drainage situations. So if we're going to start requiring a whole bunch of paving all over these lots that are already trying to get as many houses, and the developers need to maximize, how what they're building in order to actually make a profit due to basically the cost of the land consideration, because we don't, I mean, technically we can say we trump zoning codes, but the fact is that we really don't, and we shouldn't
Did we
try to do
freeze
that.
there?
Oh, did I? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep.
I have a quick question, which is like, I don't see anything in the proposed language that talks about pavement
Okay, yeah.
paved area, or is that something that you're proposing to add, or that where's that?
No, he was just talking about that from Marysville, where it was like a paved, I thought it was a paved 5 foot or something.
Yeah, that's Marysville, and
Oh, okay. I guess I haven't seen the proposal, and I guess we don't really have a proposal. This isn't really a code making. This is more of a discussion, right?
yeah. At
So,
this point, yes, because
yeah,
when we determined that there wasn't an emergency rule,
right.
that petition went away. And correct me if I'm wrong, but then we
Yeah,
wanted to have the discussion,
yeah.
and we're kind of basing it off of that. Um,
Okay.
you know,
Sorry, I went a little awry, I guess.
no, it's
I went
okay. No, this
sideways.
is all good discussion because when we have an emergency rule like that, then we're just going with that. But I think this discussion is good because we get everybody to talk about it. Like the issue with, like you just brought up, if we require it to be paved, then the impervious surface comes in, and some of the counties have a lot more strict rules with water mitigation than others, right? I think these are great points to bring up. So when we do, or if we decide to do something, I should say not when, but if, then we've had the discussion of all these points. And I think it's good discussion, honestly. Even if we get nowhere in this, I think having these discussions is huge because I think this issue is going to come up, and it came up because of the law of unintended consequences is the best way to say it. Tom did a good job. Where the legislature said you shall do this, right? But just because you shall do this doesn't mean you need to forget about certain things. And I think sometimes it has happened. And these discussions, I think, are going to make a better product at the end if we decide to do something. And that's my opinion, but I think that these are good discussions. So I think Todd, were you next?
Yeah, thank you. I froze a little bit. Okay, I'm warming up to that there could be a gap, I think, that the building code and fire code could address. Um, but it sounds to me like that it really, assuming these are multiple units, I'm just going to go right to there's probably a design professional somewhere in here, an architect that is responsible for this. Is it shame on the designer for not balancing between the the zoning development code and the building codes to meet some sort of performance requirement? Because I'd rather hear like, if you're going to do this, you shall maintain X number of inches of you know of of passage essentially through there, or at any pivot or so forth turn that you're able to accomplish that radius without getting too prescriptive. Because um, it sounds to me like the breakdown is really on encroachment that's allowed, right? We don't know that that fence permit is going to be allowed after we've agreed to where the building is located, or we should. We should plan for that, or we should allow for the heat pumps, or we should allow for um, the passive house, insulation encroaching. Those are allowed, but it's bad design if we don't accommodate them, right? So how do we enforce bad design? A good design, should say. Okay,
That's
thanks.
yeah. Okay, Jay, you're next.
Yeah. Todd, I'm actually leading the other way to say that this is not something I think the building code should be addressing because it's addressed elsewhere. One of the pieces that I looked at, I was hoping we'd see other codes, but one of the pieces I looked at before this meeting was the Department of Commerce model code for middle housing. And for the cities that don't adopt um, uh, their own custom zoning, the model code applies, and it has a 5 foot setback in the model code. So by definition, any city that hasn't adopted it is getting 5 feet. And under our proposed rule, we would say if a city doesn't specify minimum width, here's what it is. And so I'm not sure that we need to take action and complicate things. You have jurisdictions like Seattle and Marysville that are doing less than that, where they've made the judgment that that's okay, or they put in other requirements like sprinklers. I'm just not seeing I'm learning a lot through this process as a policymaker on how different individual cities might be doing this, but I'm not sure that we need to actually set a statewide standard here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. So, I'm just looking to see, making sure I'm not missing anybody with their hands, and it doesn't seem like anybody has a hand up right now. And Todd, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I thought we were looking at the possibility for this to look at maybe, and I use the word maybe, coming up with something, correct? And
Or inform, you know, if this comes up in committee in Olympia in this session, did we do our homework to advise, to inform, that conversation, or a city council or a city asks us for an opinion or whatever it might be that we're not anticipating? Because I think I do agree with you, Jay. The thing I'm struggling with is this came from essentially one city that sounds like there was disagreement within the city on how to approach this. And so there was a request for state preemption, essentially, in my interpretation, to help resolve what I thought could be dealt with at the local level. So,
but I think it also brings up the point where I think it was Joe was the one that said that, we have requirements for the side yard, but we don't have requirements for the entrance to the building. So, I think that might be what comes of this is a requirement for, and we're running into it in the single stair and all that with the elevator size too, for gurneys and all that. I'm glad we're having these discussions because I'm learning, I'm I'm smart enough to know I don't know everything and that there's other good people that are bringing up things that I just didn't consider either. So, like Angela brought up the impervious surface, that wasn't thought of. When we do this, there are rippling effects throughout all the other codes. So I'm glad we're having this discussion and and I'm glad because I'm learning a lot through this. So, Jill, your hands up.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. In terms of resolving this, I feel like there's a question which is, do we want to specify, do we think it's better to specify that a gurney needs to be able to get to each building entrance or not? It seems reasonable to me that 3 feet minimum clear width to all primary building entrances is a very reasonable and good thing to do and would not impose any undue burden on a housing supply. I think the question is, do we want to say that where a pathway turns to the building entrance, you need a 5 foot radius? I think that's the question based on all this discussion that we could answer or just at least have in our back pocket to say, if you think a gurney should get to each residence, we should probably have a radius of something clear with at a turn in a pathway, not in the entire pathway, because that's what I heard from the fire officials.
And
So I think that's the question, and the answer I think could be 3 foot under all circumstances and 5 foot at turns if the council or the legislature or others feel a gurney needs to be able to get into each of these residences.
yeah, and then the one part I think Angela brought up too is throwing out numbers, and we all know that there's great diagrams of truck radiuses and stuff like that. I don't know if we have any scientific um, measurements for a gurney that I know of. You know what I'm saying? I think that's something we would have to consider too. Because what if 5 feet's just not quite enough and you need 5'6", right? I don't know on that answer. So we're bringing up a lot of questions too. And like I think everybody that sat in on a pre-app, when they're discussing, roads, there's all these diagrams that people could pop up. So anyway, Micah, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Just a few questions I have that I don't know if they're being asked, and maybe they've been answered already in previous meetings that I may not have attended, but I'm not sure from looking at the proposal of what's been evaluated, and what sections of code, whether that's building code or residential code, have been evaluated, and how this would affect those. If you just go to the IRC, table 302, talking about fire separation, you can build up to 0 lot lines in residential without openings, rated construction, things like that. So you don't have to have a setback at all. So would we now be requiring 5 foot or more in an area that wasn't required to have setbacks in the first place? We talk about the means of egress. This keeps coming up again. I haven't seen this code breakdown of what this would actually affect. We can talk about land use codes all the time, all we want, but I think Jay mentioned that this is building code, residential code, not land use code, or fire code. If we're in the residential code again, means of egress, section 311, it states that they shall have a continuous and unobstructed path of vertical and horizontal egress from all portions of the dwelling unit to the required egress door. And then it says the egress door shall open directly into a public way or to a yard or court that opens to a public way. Again, it requires you to go out to something that's open with no minimum dimension, but most folks think that that's you're just getting outside the structure to a yard or a public way. So we talk about EEROs for residential, that's different. Those do have a 36-inch path. But again, I haven't seen a breakdown or an evaluation of these sections of code that this would affect. And I think I'm going to go with Jay on this one, that I don't think this is the right path, unobstructed path for us to do. But I think this is getting into areas that should already be covered in the code. Again, I'm completely open to looking at the egress and say a 5 foot square outside your egress door where you can turn and things like that. But the path is I think already outlined in the codes in multiple places in residential and building. And without, a good code evaluation or analysis, I think there's just a lot of speculation without that evaluation. Thanks.
Thank you, Micah. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anybody. No, I'm liking all the discussion that we're having, because from the fire side, part of me is just like, we need to do this, right? But then the other part of me, is, what are we going to affect with this? And I think that's, like Micah said, it's a huge lift on that. But I have a feeling that this will come back up again even if we, no matter what we do, if we don't do anything, it's going to come back, and somebody's probably going to propose an amendment to the 27 code. But I think we need to do something on the gurney type of thing. But like I said, this is a huge issue that we're also dealing with in the single stair. If they put in a multiplex, if they put in a elevator, we're still talking about this. And I think that's a conversation that has to continue, just because of, as Tom put, that we're requiring more of these units, but I think we still have to look at the safety of everybody involved, from the person that's in the building to the people that are going to be helping if they need to in an emergency. Todd.
Yeah, and thank you, Micah, because talking about egress and 311 in the residential code, and can someone kind of help us understand better in the IBC also what the precedent is for outside of the building? Essentially, once we get out of that door, where is it appropriate that the building code weighs in or the fire code weighs in on the site planning and egress?
Angela will have the best answers.
Well, I
Thank
was going
you.
to say you, Micah, but okay, we thrown Angela under the bus. Okay,
I was
Angela, do you have a comment?
really hoping Micah was going to step in on that. Well, to be real honest, until Chell said something about there's no requirements for the front door in the IRC, I just went back and was looking and I was like, huh. So yeah, so 310.1 does say that you have to have a 36-inch path all the way to the public way, but then 311.1 just says open to a public way or yard that opens, which what does that mean? We've always asked, what does open mean? So I think I have a note here for an amendment to the 2030 code, maybe to add that to to our 311.1. But then, I mean, the IBC is usually, I think, more, I mean, just more robust, but I'm not even sure that it fully like spells it out as far as that, but I'm opening it right now. So, I mean, if you want to talk amongst yourselves, I can look up chapter 10.
Well, I think that helps me, like just pointing to R 310.1, it's already in the code. Is
Well,
that
it
it?
is for Windows. It's for emergency rescue openings,
Oh,
not for the, and like Chell said, not for the front door. For the front door, you have to, it says you have to have 36 inches to get to that door from inside. And then you have to get outside, and then you're required to have a 36-inch landing. So you're going to have a 36 by 36-inch square outside that door for the most part. But then it just says it must open to a public way or a yard that opens to the public way. So is open to the public way a path of any size? Is it a minimum size? So I think, so that's where there's a small, I think we all, I mean, when we look at the code, sometimes we just make assumptions. It's not spelled out, but personally, I would say 36-inch path. But again, when we get into, there's things that, you know, we can't enforce. And I feel like this pathway situation is going to become one of those things because, like you said, somebody's going to use that, whether it's paved or not. They're going to put their lawnmower there. They're going to, you know, put things, they're going to store stuff. People use all the space they have. And so, and according to the code, fences do not require permits. So we're going to do this entire development, put all these fancy paths, everything like that, and all of a sudden you're going to get a fence. It's just going to, and nobody's going to know or be able to do anything until an emergency or something arises. So again, this is going to be really hard to maintain unless the fire people want to go out there and do inspections on a yearly basis, and I don't think they do, and they don't have the people to do it. So, Micah.
You are spot on, Angela. I was just going to throw in on the commercial side, Todd, I think you asked some of that too. What you're talking about, again, I think it might have been Jay or somebody else talking about design. It comes down to design because in the commercial code, you're going to be talking about exit discharge. And 1028.3 gives you specific exit discharge or width or capacity. It's not specific. It says the minimum width or required capacity shall be of the exit discharge shall not be less than the minimum width or required capacity of the exits being served. So, you know, there's no specific dimension there either. So it is a variable depending on design. Again, this is getting into, there's not a, you all are correct. There's not a clear, exact defined dimension in the codes, but there are variables based on design and allowances. So there's your answer to that. And we get farther down a hole on this if we need to, but there you go.
Thank you. And Jill?
With the commercial code, as you read, Micah, there is a specific width, and that's the width of the stair or the egress that is being served by the connection to the public way. So it is specific, and if we did the same thing in the residential code, it would be 36 inches because that's what's required inside the building to get to the public way, to the exterior. And then if you said the same thing you say in this commercial code, in the residential code, you would then take that 36 and that would be the clear width to the public way for the residential code. So I think it is reasonable to have a 36-inch clear width, at least in the design of the building to get there. And if somebody puts a lawnmower, that's beyond the code. But planning for a 36-inch clear width, I think gives certainty to the designer, developer, and the fire folks.
Thanks, Joel. And then Angela, you had your hand up, but then it went away.
I was just going to note that it appears in the IBC that it's the same as the IRC kind of, because your exit discharge gets you out of the building and says you have to have access to, the public way. But then 1028.5 access to public way just simply says the exit discharge shall provide a direct path or unobstructed access to a public way. And if you can't, then you provide a gathering area. So it's kind of it gets a little convoluted still.
I also wanted to point out that in the 2024 IRC, it's section 318.1, whereas in the 2021 IRC, it's section 311.1.
I always love when they do that.
Yeah, they shifted a lot of stuff the last cycle. They're shifting more this cycle for 2027 too. I do want to throw out though the chill for the 36-inch. That's not necessarily the minimum in the building code. 1005 is your means of egress sizing, which is based on component and measurements and all these type of capacities, your occupant loads, things like that. So there's a calculation that's supposed to be done there. I think you could get there, but again, I think my main point was all these code sections have not been provided some type of analysis with the original proposed code change and how we got to 5 feet and why, other than the turning radius at a door for a gurney. Beyond that, I don't think we've been provided with enough information, or you all, I'm not on the tag, or on the SBC, as you see, I made a mention of that the other day in another meeting. You all don't think have been provided with enough information to make a clear winner choice out of this, in my opinion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Micah. And even though you're not on the code council and stuff, your opinion does matter because everybody's opinion I think matters in this. So, Todd.
Mike is on the collective code council. He can't get off. So.
It's a disease, Micah.
Todd
you just lost your vote, Mike. It doesn't mean you're not on us.
Yeah. No, just because I have a vote doesn't mean I'm not stuck, right? No, I'm just kidding. Right. Thanks.
Okay, so I think this helps a lot. I don't know. I do believe there are breakdowns within cities, but I also have complete confidence in planners in our cities that they will learn this provision as we get into these new typologies, and that will be the first thing that a planner will look for when, or utility, or kind of the engineering departments in the cities will look for when developers start doing pre-development meetings. So I guess I don't know that I see a huge problem. It might be an education, and there might be something that helps cities, but I don't know that preemption is the answer at this point.
Yeah, and my cynicism, though, Todd, when you say you trust planners and stuff, I being in the business I am, I get to the point where I don't trust anybody, because but I also know we can't regulate our way out of everything, right? That's a huge point that has to be done. I just have been to, and it kind of colors it, and that's why I'm glad we're having this, is I've actually been to a house that had 30-foot setbacks and the fire department couldn't get to them because they had over 5,000 totes full of hoarding stuff in it, right? And so they had to take 20 minutes to make a path to the house just to fight the fire. There's always what ifs, there's always exceptions. Legislating our way is not always the right way. and I think we need to have good guidelines um, to make things, but we can't make a code or anything that does 100% right. That's where we have to look at it. And I think you're right in some aspects there, Todd, that this was an issue that was a local issue that kind of got brought forward. But it does, especially sitting on the multiplex housing and stuff with the elevators, there's discussions to be had with the fire safety elements for people. And honestly, most people are going to want at least a 3 foot wide pathway because they have to carry beds and dressers in, right? And their groceries and all that. So there is a design element that has to be dealt with by the designer. You're not going to put a 2 foot setback between buildings and expect people to carry their groceries down it. So go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, and I think what I meant is, we all have different domains, and everyone needs to work together and not necessarily a power struggle. Because as I've expressed, I've spent 8 years on a planning commission. I know others here have also, or been actually part of planning departments, and I do feel confident that they could catch us. And I think there's a lot on the designer. I think there's a lot in the professional responsibility for the designer to know this and not design buildings that don't allow this. So I guess that's where more of my head is going.
Yeah.
Mm.
No, and like I said, I'm very grateful for all these discussions, and I respect everybody's opinion here, because we all have different aspects where we come from. So Dustin.
So as we've been talking, one of the things that was one of the things I didn't consider was that turn radius for coming out of our primary doors on the primary structure on properties. This is kind of resulting as the legislatures directed the cities to allow more density in these areas where you're going to have smaller setbacks. Um, you know, I Mike, I guess the concern I'm trying to raise is if you have an existing building that may just barely meet some of these standards we're talking about, they might, have zero lot line, no EEROs on one side of the house, and then they go and they build a ADU in the backyard. How does these clear widths that we're talking about get applied if someone builds this and then all of a sudden they create the situation with a new building? That wasn't there. The problem wasn't there. They didn't need firefighters running to the backyard to help people egress and fight fires in the backyard. It seems to me that when the emergency rule came to the SBCC, that it wasn't discussing the primary structure on the building that might have the street facing garage. It's the backyard ADUs that might suffer lack of firefighter access in the event of emergency. And so, here in the discussion, I do feel like the requirement should kind of lay within the zoning code and be caught at those development meetings. And I just don't know if there's a good path to, recommend a minimum width for buildings that don't exist, that are beyond maybe the initial planning for a site. And so I just kind of wanted to raise that consideration. I think that most people are, when they plan a detached ADU in the backyard, they're going to make a pathway for the tenants of that building to get back there. But is a pathway that might go along a 3 foot setback with it, might have a fence encroaching a little bit, might have a heat pump encroaching a little bit, might have some insulation encroaching a little bit. At what point does the consideration for something that's being created, is there room for a standard for the building code for detached structures in the back of these buildings, to have a requirement? And that's all.
Thanks, Dustin. Todd, I think you just beat
Yeah.
Jay with your hand.
Oh, well, I'll be quick. Thank you. I think it's a good point, Dustin. I think it goes too far, though. I think you can't regulate to what, zoning code is what is potential and you're allowed to do. It's kind of like saying, I'm going to tap into the water main and I have the option between small, medium, and large, and you're going to regulate and say you have to put the, you know, the large tap at all times because of the potential you could add an ADU in the back. You know, it's really up to the developer and the owner to make that decision. And then now, last thing I'll say is, insurance and other things are going to start to, and market forces are also going to start to dictate some of these decisions. So it might not have to be regulated. Okay, thanks.
Okay, Jay?
And then my only point on this is that I think there are some good issues raised if the full state building code council or the legislature wanted to do this. This seems like something that might be good for an appendix for jurisdictions that haven't already dealt with this. And certainly the issues, as other people have mentioned, are ripe for consideration as we're looking at some other special work groups for things like the single exits. But again, I think, so I think we should figure out how to just memorialize this conversation at the very least, so it can apply to something in the future.
All right, thanks, Jay. One of the things, and I'm cognizant of, is, and Patrick had mentioned this in the past, is sometimes we just take a long time doing stuff, and then coming up with stuff. But I think in this case, the time was well spent to educate. So, but it sounds like what I'm hearing is we're not going to be doing anything code wise. I don't think there's I think the consensus is more we need to just look at other things too. So, Todd, your thoughts on that, since you're the
Yep.
chair of the Building Code Council?
I think so too. I think we're nearing an end on this, our kind of research, experiment here. I think it helps inform Dustin, unless it's already out the door, the response to the proponent. 'Cause I think that we do owe that. And then I think that document also helps to memorialize this conversation for future reference. Does that seem acceptable?
I think it does to me. I'm looking around, it looks like people are nodding their heads. So if somebody's totally against that, please say so. Excuse me. Dustin, your thoughts?
I would definitely use the conversations we've had here to inform the petition denial. And I'm not hearing any need to do any rulemaking as a result of the conversation. And my thought would be to let proponents drive any building code change that might result as from these deliberations. Let it be a public-driven proposal, not necessarily something crafted by the SBCC. That's, by all rights, sounds like everybody's in consensus that no actions needed other than to finalize our responses to that petition.
And then I think, the discussion's good, because I think I have a feeling that this is going to come up again. So, but thank you everybody for your time. Like I said, this has been very helpful for me. I'm hoping it's helpful to everybody else. I respect everybody's opinion here. And I think we've had good discussion on it. And Dustin, what do we have to do do we have to send an answer to the proponent of this? Because we had already denied the emergency rule. Just a procedural
Yes,
question.
they are due a response letter from the SBCC, so I can get working on that. The other thing I think would be a recommendation from this committee to the council as a kind of closure of the business for this committee. We I think have arrived kind of at the end of our road for the moment, and a recommendation to do no rulemaking in response and let the code development process drive future changes would be most appropriate.
Okay, so I need to get a motion for that, so that way we have it and a vote to get it to council?
Yes, sir.
Okay, do I have anybody want to propose
I'll do it. I move to direct the staff to prepare a letter to the council with those recommendations. I guess that's
Second.
it.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All right, not hearing anything, we'll take a vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 And any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes, and we've just given Dustin more to do. Appreciate you though, Dustin. You know,
It's part of what I'm here for. So no complaints. I will get it drafted up. We already have a draft in work, and so it shouldn't take too long to synthesize our conversations here today.
all right. Well, everybody, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot during this. I hope everybody else has. And we will give you about 54 minutes of your time back on a Friday. So, all right, everybody, thank
Well
you
done.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.